Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending. I'll give a brief introduction, then I'll turn it over to our speaker, Neil. So I'm Nick Floyd. I'm part of the HRC committee for this spring speaker series. I work at SGH, a consulting engineering firm, and most of my experience is investigating and rehabilitating enclosure work as the engineer on these projects. So it fits in well with our theme for this spring's talks, which I'll get to in a second. SGH, we were the enclosure consultant for the recent Rothko campus expansion, and we work with ARO on a couple of other projects, just how I know Neil and roped him in for tonight's talk. So tonight's the first of 5 monthly talks that we're going to give with the HRC Spring Speaker Series. The goal of this series is to promote exceptional historic preservation and rehabilitation projects, including lessons learned and innovative strategies that we as community members and design and construction professionals can learn from when working on existing and historic buildings, here and elsewhere. The theme of this particular spring speaker series is preservation perspectives. So the goal is to explore Houston-specific projects with an emphasis on interdisciplinary nature of these types of jobs. So we start tonight with an architect, but the remaining talks in the series are speakers with different professional backgrounds who will share different experiences and different perspectives on preservation rehabilitation projects all in the Houston area, which is exciting. So the speaker series is organized by the AIA Houston Historic Resources Committee, or HRC. The HRC promotes preservation in the Houston area through this speaker series and other events that are intended to engage members, allied professional organizations, public, everyone that's attending here, et cetera. If anybody's interested in participating, please contact the chair, the staff liaison. You can look on the AIA website and find HRC, and their email addresses are on there. So we're happy to have more participants if y'all are interested. I'd also like to thank the HRC partners, including APT Texas, Houston Mod, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Preservation Houston and Pier and Beam, and the Heritage Society at Sam Houston Park. These partnerships are critical to the HRC's mission of preserving architectural heritage in the greater Houston area. Finally, I'll introduce the speaker. So Neil Patel is from the Architecture Research Office in New York. He's a project director. He holds a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Texas at Austin, and he joined our ARO in 2008 and has worked on numerous ARO projects, including recently leading the renovation and phase 1 campus expansion of the Rothko Chapel. And he's currently overseeing phase 2 of the campus expansion. And with that, I will turn it over to Neil.
Thanks for the introduction, Nick. And thank you to the Historic Resource Committee and AIA Houston for having me here. I'm going to share my screen. Maybe, Nick, you can give me confirmation that you can see what's going on.
It's good.
Great. All right, so as Nick mentioned, I'm Neil Patel. I'm a project director at ARO. I've been at ARO for 14 years now. And actually, Rothko Chapel was a really exciting project for me personally to be able to work on. I grew up in Texas in the Woodlands and went to the University of Texas at Austin. So I was aware of the chapel growing up in high school, but not fully aware of its greater mission dealing with human rights and social justice in the world. So learning more about that as in the course of this project was something that was really exciting to me. So today I'm going to talk about the Rothko Chapel project and ARO's involvement, and specifically in ways in which our project team was able to focus early in the project to define project concepts and principles that really aligned the project with the chapel's mission in the service of executing that project. So talking about the alignment of mission and how we translated that directly into the architecture of the project. So ARO is a firm of 30 based in New York City, led by partners Stephen Cassell, Adam Urinsky, and Kim Yao. Adam is, I think, lurking in the audience tonight. And our core team on this project also included Alyssa Chastain, who's the project manager with me. And our firm creates architecture that unites beauty and form with strategy and intelligence. And we pride ourselves in a deep engagement with history, legacy, and mission to create designs with integrity that support an authentic experience. And that really that approach served us really well with Rothko, and also served us in prior related projects for the Judd Foundation, Vilcek Foundation, and institutions like CBST, the world's largest LGBTQ synagogue in the world. So those different cultural clients shared a lot of overlap with Rothko in their mission of overlapping art and social justice. One thing about, before I dive into the project details itself, one thing that was really interesting about the way that the chapel board and committee sort of engaged the designers for the project is that the architecture team, the lighting designer, and the landscape architect were all interviewed independently from each other. So we were hired and interviewed sort of as part of a separate process. And this was really interesting, I think, really intelligent way in which the chapel identified the key attributes of the project, being architecture, lighting, and landscape, and identify the right partners through a pretty comprehensive proposal and interview process to find partners that were like-minded and whose kind of ethos and mission, or ethos and values, aligned with theirs, and then kind of brought that team together to really focus on the project and encouraged a process and a framework of collaboration. And I think the way that set up just from the outset of the project really set the stage for a successful collaboration for all of us, including the chapel itself. So Rothko Chapel itself is the product of an amazingly fruitful collaboration between patron and artist, between Dominique and de Menil and Mark Rothko. During the course of our project, we were able to do a deep dive into that legacy and history of the chapel through interviews with past directors, deep engagement with the actual physical archives on site, and attendance at their board retreats over multiple years. And the building committee that was set up by the chapel included, chaired by Christopher Rothko, and included local architects, local historian Stephen Fox, and others. And that committee was really both nimble and had a broad and deep range of experience that really served the project well. The project was also served by the amazing collaborators that I mentioned before, the landscape and lighting team, the landscape architect of Nelson Birdwolds, a firm based in New York and Houston, were the landscape architects on the project, and George Sexton Associates from Washington, D.C. Were hired as the lighting designer for the project. And I'll get into a little bit more of our collaborations with them further on in the presentation. So the Renewal's commissioned Rothko to achieve something that he had long sought to do, to create a place and a space that would touch the deepest emotions. This is an image of his studio space in Manhattan, which some members of the project team actually had the opportunity to visit as a course of the research for the project. You'll note here in this space a skylight with a light diffusing parachute that will sort of come up later in terms of how the chapel, the panels were introduced into the hot Texas sun and light. As I mentioned before, the chapel's archive was a really invaluable resource to us and the design team to help us understand the initial conception of the chapel. Using this chapel archive to understand how the chapel evolved through the initial collaboration between Philip Johnson, who was initially involved, and Mark Rothko. And ultimately, Mark Rothko's vision of a more modest, non-monumental building, where the 14 panels define the occupant's experience and define the architecture of the space, prevailed over Philip Johnson's more monumental vision, which you sort of see on the left here, where there's a tall oculus, a large vertical space. And this was also part of the project as it was conceived, located on the adjacent University of St. Thomas campus. Our work with the archives also included interviews with the original architect, Gene Arbery, as well as construction notes that helped us to gain a broader understanding of sort of the initial intent for a lot of the design decisions, which really helped guide a lot of our decisions and thinking as the project developed. So the chapel was completed in 1971. They just celebrated their 50th anniversary last year. Unfortunately, Mark Rothko did not live to see the chapel open. He passed away in 1970. But one thing that was immediately apparent on the installation of the panels within that room is that the unfiltered Houston light coming through the central skylight was too harsh. And really in this image, you see from a number of historical images, sort of either the ground plane in front of the panels was too bright and the panels themselves were relegated to darkness, or there was an over-reliance on artificial lighting for the site. So sort of immediately upon completion, there were some significant challenges that need to be addressed. And over the course of the last 50 years, there have been a number of significant renovations, particularly mostly to deal with the challenge of that skylight in the space. And central to the experience of the room and the panels is the quality of daylight. And the initial intent was sort of conceived of in the New York studio with a kind of diffuse level of daylight. In 1974, so one of the first interventions to address it, installed a scrim sort of into the opening and plugged that opening, and this sort of this caused a over-reliance on artificial lighting in the space and really changed and kind of eliminated the connection to the daylight to the outside. Subsequent renovations tried to mitigate that by still maintaining a fairly opaque plug or block under the skylight, and then letting light around a perimeter and a central oculus as the most recent renovation in 1999, which also included a number of HVAC additions to the project. And really, this was sort of the condition on the right here in 1999 when we started looking at the project in 2016. This is sort of the last major renovation to the project. And the result of the skylight intervention is really a somewhat somber, subdued experience within the chapel. And we know that one of the charges from the building committee was to restore the chapel experience to something that was closer to the original intent of Mark Rothko. But zooming back out before we go back into the chapel itself, as powerful as that interior experience of the chapel is, the relationship between the chapel itself and the adjacent surrounding residential neighborhood is just as important. And this idea was central to the de Menil's vision of the sacred within the context of the everyday, or the accessibility of the sense of spirituality that you get within the chapel itself. The neighborhood over time, so you see here that the boundaries of the Rothko Chapel holdings sort of extend within Menil Park just to the west, and you see the Menil collection further to the west, and there's a necklace of bungalows, as we came to call it. Mostly are primarily owned by the Menil Foundation, and the Rothko Chapel holdings are distinct from that, and they comprise lots on the east side of this block. So there's Sul Ross to the north, Yupon to the east, Brainerd to the south, and West Alabama as a block further north. And this neighborhood has undergone a number of changes in recent history, the expansion of the University of St. Thomas to the east, as well as development along West Alabama and the expansion of the Menil Collection kind of campus of buildings. And so there's an understanding that there's a desire and a need to frame the Rothko Chapel's boundaries, but also a clear direction to ensure that those boundaries do not inhibit the accessibility and openness of the chapel, and that boundary needed to be a porous one. So the chapel, as it stands, was established and has had a place for the last 50 years, and our charge was really to strengthen the experience both inside and out. And over the course of many visits during the design process, we sort of came to understand more clearly how the chapel's impact within its environment and context. And then connected with the architecture itself, or inseparable from the architecture experience within the chapel itself, is the programming associated with the chapel. So the social connection embodied in that, and Rothko Chapel is more than just a place in a building. It encompasses its programming and mission as well. And so our task was to understand how can the architecture and the planning support this mission. So the chapel, as we understood it and understand it, it exists sort of at the intersection of art, spirituality, and human rights. And as a result of the success of their programming, there's been growth over in the recent past, and the boundaries of the chapel itself sort of no longer hold the ambitions and the programming that the chapel would like to have. So that was like one of the clearest challenges that the project needed to address. And so really initially, kind of at the outset of our design process, we started to understand and clarify some of these concepts and ideas about the project, and develop this sort of very conceptual diagram that really summarizes this duality of the chapel and the ideas of contemplation and action. Contemplation being focused on achieving Mark Rothko's original intentions, that this space within the chapel engaged an individual's deepest emotions, and the ideas embodied within the contemplation would underlie the renovation of the chapel as a component of the project. And that is not just about renovating the chapel itself, but it's also about designing an experience that happens over time, starting from when you kind of arrive to the campus and make your way through the campus into the building and into the sanctuary. So making sure that the experience is foregrounded within that idea. And then the idea of action, and that sort of embodying the ideals and programming of the chapel itself. So creating space and place to have those programs, and the concept of the call to action within the community is really embodied and represented by Barnett Newman's broken obelisk sculpture in the reflecting pool in front of the chapel, which was dedicated to Martin Luther King Jr. So out of kind of that really rough but clear defining concepts, we developed project principles in collaboration with the project building committee, and we spent a lot of time with the chapel and with the design team, making sure that these represented the full range of what the project's ambitions were. And we did this to guide a master planning effort prior to the development of the actual details of the project. So these were primarily, or the largest component of this was strengthening the quality of experience both inside and outside of the chapel. And I'll come to that kind of again and again throughout this presentation. The idea of the experience and an individual and a group's experience within these spaces, both exterior and interior, was really important, and it allowed a sense of we were able to inform what that was by our own experiences, by the experiences of the local community, by the board, and our historical research with the archive. So I think there was a lot of fruitful discussion and leeway in terms of how that experience, the existing condition of that experience could be strengthened through the course of the project itself. In addition to that, ideas of stewardship and improving facilities in support of the chapel's mission, planning for the long term, including strategies for resilience, and then the last one on this list, respecting the unique relationship of found versus designed, and balancing preservation and intent, was something that really unique to the chapel and to the site, where there's a very clear formality and rigor and structure within the chapel itself, but then a intentional informality with elements of the landscape or elements of the site itself that were embraced and kind of inherent part of the project site. So these principles really deeply informed our master planning process that ultimately led to the architecture and landscape and lighting design. So those principles sort of led into a really iterative process. This is kind of a summary or a small portion of the master planning process, where we really investigated, I want to say countless, it was a lot of options where we'd really expand the breadth of possibilities and then refine them through discussion with the building committee. These help define program elements like a welcome center, expanded administrative space, and a new meeting space, and mechanical infrastructure as kind of the primary components of the project. And then as the project developed, we also developed a concept of a north campus across Solroth Street and a south campus. And that kind of division or expansion of the idea of what the Rothko Chapel's campus was really helped drive the project forward. Looking at the North Campus itself, we used a number of different tools like these model studies, recognizing, and I'll get to this a little further, that we were creating a sort of semi-urban environment within the residential bungalow, that necklace that surrounds Mill Park and the Mill Collection. And these studies helped us to calibrate massing, scale, and proportion of the new buildings relative to the context. It was important for us that the new buildings, any kind of new construction, feel part of their context, which is very residential, but also public. And striking that balance is really important. There's a plaque in front of the chapel right now that says "Open every day and all are welcome," and that kind of summarizes the idea of accessibility of this kind of space, and that ideal needed to carry over to kind of all of the expanded infrastructure. And so as a result of that master planning process, this is sort of the final outcome of that process. And subsequent to this, we sort of broke it into a phase 1 and a phase 2 that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. But this master plan really reframes the chapel itself within a new landscape, within a garden. So the administrative bungalows that currently exist to the west of the chapel were removed, and that location is turned into a meditation garden. On the north side of the campus, we have the administrative offices were moved to a new building with an archive. The program center houses a meeting room that's essentially takes the pressure off of the chapel to support the types of events and programming. So it allows the chapel itself to be focused on its its use as a place of sanctuary and a place of contemplation. And then the Welcome House as a visitor center and a starting entry point to the campus for visitors. The new architecture mediates between the neighborhood and chapel grounds, and it respects the binary relationship that currently exists between the chapel and Broken Obelisk, which is a really critical relationship to maintain. And these two diagrams elaborate the scope of work that we undertook for the chapel restoration. And it's important to understand that the approach to this renovation was not a faithful restoration of any point in the past. It was really a renovation to achieve what the original intent was. And that's why it's very important for us to have a shared understanding and an informed understanding of what the original intent was. So that's where it kind of comes back to the idea of experience and what the desired experience is for a visitor to this space. So I'll also mention that it's sort of the project where a lot of the work that we did is hidden, or at least you might not know is there, the thought that went into it. So I'll share a little bit more about some of those elements, but the overall scope of work from next year included a repair of the brick, replacement of the roof, replacement of the skylight as part of the new lighting strategy, which I'd like to get into more detail because that was the primary or the most kind of transformational scope of the chapel renovation was the new lighting strategy. But other elements that are embedded in here is flood protection, new seals or new doors for acoustic seals, resiliency measures, including relocating mechanical equipment to a raised mezzanine across the street. On the interior of the building, addressing acoustic concerns, audiovisual storage, an entry sequence, and other HVAC upgrades. So we touched a lot of the building, but in a lot of ways, we sort of hope you can't tell. And sort of parallel to kind of that initial diagram that I showed of contemplation and action, there are a number of kind of other conceptual diagrams that really kind of were derived very early in the process that helped drive a lot of the design decisions and sort of summarized kind of pretty clearly some of the desires for the project. So this is conceptually a diagram that was developed by George Sexton's associates, where I'll have to explain a little bit. There's an existing condition and a proposed condition. What this is showing is as you circulate from the exterior of the building to the interior of the chapel sanctuary, this is the level of light that you're experiencing. So in the hot Houston or the bright Houston sun, we're up at 10,000 foot candles, and in the original chapel, you immediately drop into a very tight, dark vestibule before you kind of enter back into the sanctuary. And so the thought here is that type of experience does not allow your eye to adjust in enough time in order to properly appreciate the detail and the quality and the depth of the Rothko panels, and a experience that's much more graduated, where your light level and your experience of light is slowly reduced from a maximum to a level over time. So we're talking about a sequence of events, and this is where the conception of your experience through of the chapel and of the site starts when you arrive to the site and overlaps with landscape, architecture, and lighting. And so this type of mediating your experience and your eyes exposure to light in preparation for the experience that we're trying to uphold and refine within the chapel, not only impacted the lighting design, lighting strategy, it also impacted the landscape and architecture. And I'll just talk quickly about the process in developing that lighting approach, because there's a lot of care and thought that went into that portion of the renovation. So this is a picture of a 1:12 model on the roof of George Sexton Associates office in Washington, D.C., which was a really useful tool to prove proof of concept and prove out that the strategy that is essentially creates a multi-layered skylight diffusing layer, which consists of the top layer of glass, which is a diffusing layer of glass, and then individually directed louvers that have a kind of different color on the top and the bottom that help to direct light onto the wall. So there's some light directed at the floor, but primarily instead of getting reflected light, it's directing light directly towards the walls and the panels. So the panels themselves are getting the benefit of that, and also raising the light level at the panels themselves. This is partner Stephen Cassell within the model. The model was kind of big enough to where not only could you put photometers and measure light levels in there, but you could actually experience this. And this was a really effective tool for us to communicate with the building committee, for everybody to have an understanding, because these elements that we were studying are experiential in nature. And this was a way for us to, at a very practical and physical level, experience the effect of the proposal. So there's a 3D printed mini louver system within this, and this model also served as a tool for us to test out finish colors for the ceilings and the ring itself as the project developed. That process of development also kind of expanded as the project developed to full scale mock-up. So this is showing after some demolition a portion or a segment of the skylight underneath the existing skylight before the skylight was replaced, a section of louver that really at a much greater scale again proved out that proof of concept, where we were able to determine within the space the effect of that light directing louver system onto the existing walls, and then other elements that are part of that lighting system, where projectors are used to actually are used as light fixtures to provide a very carefully calibrated light projection on the walls and panels themselves. And we were lucky enough to work with really good collaborators in the finish and fabrication and overall coordination of the chapel itself. So we worked with Lionel as the construction manager, Lindbeck as a construction manager, and Lionel as the fabricator and design assist partner for the chapel skylight. And I'll also mention, as part of the development of the louver system itself, we developed this, I think we call it like a technical ring surrounding that, where we were able to house almost all of the kind of technical AV lighting, sensors, fire alarm components, all within a fairly tight space, and all that's accessible by operable panels, and everything. The lower scrim of the louver system itself can be detached for cleaning. This all was a fun and challenging exercise of coordination and fitting a lot of equipment and function within a very tight space. And ultimately, the measure of success, as I kind of mentioned, is the extent to which our presence as architects is sort of invisible, and the ultimate experience that you have in the space is just of you and the 14 panels in the space that are kind of all conceived as a single installation and experience. And really the final result within that space fully kind of connects you within that space to the sky, and the dynamic qualities of light. When a cloud goes over the sun, you understand that greater connection within the space to the greater world. And I think it hit kind of the ambition of being transformational while also being invisible. And I'll go into a little bit of the details about the some of kind of what's behind the walls that is invisible. So things like as a course of construction, we were able to actually evaluate the way the building initially operated. So I'll go back here. Before the renovation, if you look at existing photos, we noticed that there's because there's an apse on the north end of the chapel, and because of the skylight, there is a hard shadow line that always has existed there and was maintained, actually improved a little bit by our skylight, but there's still a hard shadow line. And the location of and position of each of the panels was very clearly defined by Mark Rothko, but we had the opportunity to potentially reevaluate where that shadow line existed. I think in the existing condition, there's only about 1.5 inches between the top of the panel and that shadow line, and it really felt like it was too close or it was almost overlapping. And so, through discussion with the board, we determined that pushing this wall forward would not impact your experience of the space. It would kind of retain the primacy of that apse as the focus of the room, but just that additional 3 or 4 inches of unshadow or daylight on top of that panel would actually improve your experience and your kind of the legibility of the panel on that wall. So there were a number of conditions like that were very, very subtle. Literally, this wall moved 6 inches forward, and you may never notice if you didn't know. But I think it was all in the service of an effect that kind of cumulatively impacts your feeling of the space. Again, this is just another completed photo, and here I'll just mention that the skylight itself and the louvers were sort of exposed. There's a transparent scrim underneath it, but they're sort of exposed intentionally and matter-of-factly and become part of the space. And part of that is to also allow the experience of, when a cloud does cross over the sun, you do want to have that connection. You want to have the subtle changing of light over the course, of 10 minutes, as well as like over the course of a day, over the course of a season. Every time you go in there, you might have a slightly different experience of light and an experience of space. Through the course of the renovation itself, during demolition, we noticed cracking in the existing CMU, and after analysis and engagement by a forensic engineer, we determined that there was no vertical reinforcing in the original masonry construction. So a campaign was undertaken to install vertical rebar essentially in the entire perimeter of the existing building. So you would never know this, but we essentially tore apart the entire interior of the building in order to structurally reinforce it and make it resistant to more frequent larger storms, which are expected. So that's something that was unexpected, but ultimately a benefit for the project and for the life of the project. The project also addressed acoustic issues in the existing building. So the existing condition had this kind of rough popcorn ceiling that had been painted over and didn't perform in any kind of absorptive way. And also that because of the raking light was really aesthetically undesirable from our part. In addition, there is a glass wall installed between the vestibule and the sanctuary space as a part of the 1999 renovation, which installed HVAC in the system. So that was part of both an acoustic and environmental seal. we worked with Threshold Acoustics as the acoustic consultant and our collaborator to develop a system that was tailored to the building. So this is a diagram showing two different types of acoustic plaster that have the same finish but different performance. So the red is showing an absorptive surface, and the white areas are showing a reflective surface. And so allowing that space to be tuned in order to provide the best experience for the multiple events that happen within that space, while maintaining and kind of improving an existing kind of finished surface as well. Looking back at the glass wall itself, so this was kind of the primary architectural intervention within the building occurs kind of within this vestibule and foyer, this kind of anteroom before you enter the sanctuary. These are two images. On the right here is kind of the main entries to the right. There is a reception desk and then a guest book and a donation box and things like that. Sort of all of this entire sequence of events as the project developed sort of became to be thought as a sort of impediment to the kind of like the pure experience of the chapel. So ultimately what we did was we looked at the elements here, including the reception desk, and tried to clarify that and simplify that in service of making a more elemental or cleaner, more personal, less inhibited experience of the chapel and of the painting. So this is showing the existing conditions where you'd enter via the south, check in at the reception desk, and kind of enter through these doors, which are always closed for environmental reasons, and then enter into the space. And then the proposal, which essentially condenses that entry sequence into this front zone. So it required us to move this south pair of doors further south, but still maintain a sort of recess from the south to kind of ensure that some of that original kind of intent and relief from the south side and from the plaza was maintained. But what that allowed this to do was it allowed this room itself to be enlarged and created as it sort of condenses the entry sequence, creates those two doors which are able to be kind of automatically controlled, and then it pulls you into a larger zone that can be used for longer duration. So again, this is back in the service of creating these mediated steps of experience before you get to the sanctuary itself. So places to pause, places to let your eyes adjust to the slightly increased or slightly lowered level of light as you move from the exterior to the interior of the space. So kind of moving from the sanctuary back out as we're doing into the landscape itself. So this is another one of those kind of early developed conceptual ideas that kind of expands on the idea of contemplation and action from the landscape, and sort of embeds these kind of transitory interstitial spaces of preparation and reflection in between those. So you understand, you sort of enter at the site arrive at the site somewhere. That's actually the site's very unique in that we're not able to predict where somebody, a visitor, would enter. And so part of the challenge is directing people to and making the visitor center or the welcome center that was created, making that to be a beacon or a logical place that people would know to go. But then starting your experience of the site there and finding an opportunity for these spaces in between that arrival and before you get into and experience the chapel itself. So what that looks like is the creation of spaces like the birch grove at the east side of the chapel and the future meditation garden on the west as spaces and places that are adjacent to the chapel part of the sequence of circulation and access, and that also serve to exist within that that procession of readiness and also preparation of your eye to experience the paintings. The phase one also includes a welcome center on the north side of Sol Ross, and this includes program. It's essentially the place of arrival, but includes a reception desk, a gift shop, restrooms, lockers, and a small exhibition area. It's really a simple, roughly 1,000 square foot structure of enclosed area surrounded by a 11-foot high trellis and canopy. The building itself is really porch-like in scale and corresponds directly in scale and size and height to the bungalow necklace surrounding the building, and as well as an extension of the canopy of live oaks that line Sol Ross and the neighborhood in general. The building itself is fundamentally open to views both to and from campus, and it needs to be in order to be kind of like the one public element on this surrounding necklace. There's a need for it to kind of balance the scale of the residential with the openness of a public event. And it's also a waypoint along the journey to find the chapel. And this is a view from the far north end looking back, and you sort of see the connection between the Welcome Center itself, the chapel on the oblique view, and then in the distance, Broken Obelisk, which all of these elements were considered and thought of as a whole ensemble. And so this is an overview of what currently exists after phase one. So this is how the site exists right now with the chapel, the administration buildings, the Welcome House. We didn't get to talk into too much detail about the Energy House, which houses a generator and mechanical equipment and electrical equipment serving the chapel on a raised mezzanine floor, as well as a guest house. And then expanding that into phase two with the expansion of the Energy House into a program center, the creation of an administration and archives building, as well as kind of the clarification on the south campus of the chapel within a park. So the removal of those admin buildings and the creation of the meditation garden. So creating, we sort of had to ask ourselves with the expansion of the program, what it means to create space for Rothko Chapel and what it means to create new architecture. And it's really about more than just the buildings themselves. It's really about creating the space in between the buildings. And so integrating that space between the scale of these more public institutional buildings and the scale of the neighborhood. All of this is also in the service of enhancing the sanctity of the chapel as an exceptional place, and also a carefully calibrated informality, which doesn't compete with the relationship now of the chapel and the Broken Obelisk itself. So here we have just functionally the chapel itself. The obelisk is further south, the meditation garden, the Welcome House, the program center, and the administration and archives building surrounding a program courtyard. In section, this is the north-south section, so looking east, cutting through the obelisk far to the south, the plaza, the chapel, crossing Sol Ross, the courtyard space, and the program building. And you'll notice a direct relationship between the program room, the meeting room within the program building, and the room of the chapel. The proportions and height and size of that room is such that you can essentially inscribe the chapel octagonal plan within this program center. And really, there was a desire and need to kind of make that architectural relationship manifest in the new building. And from a programmatic standpoint, there's a clear relationship between the two, and that this program building is seen as a public interpretation of the type of public space, or the type of program space that the chapel is currently used as. This is showing a daytime elevation along Sol Ross at the North Campus. So you see the Welcome House to the west, the Program Center beyond, and the administration building to the east. The size, the width and height of this volume matches exactly the corresponding volume of the north side of the chapel right across the street. So there's a direct relationship and acknowledgement of the chapel from this. We also pushed back the largest mass from the street in order to minimize the scale of the building, and also screen larger buildings beyond on West Alabama. And then the Welcome House itself is really an interpretation of the scale of those residential bungalows. The material palette of the neighborhood was really carried into the building itself. So the use of wood siding, Menil gray paint, some brick on the Welcome House, and really also thinking of dappled white as part of the material palette. So ensuring that's a consistent element within the building itself. And this is an entry view from Sol Ross looking north. This path connects to new pathways in the plaza. Beyond, you see the balance between this public scale and the residential scale, and really a simplicity, directness, and modesty with the treatment of the buildings. So simplicity of forms, residential scaled windows and openings, trying to make that balance between an institutional and an institutional building within a residential scale. This is the entry view from Sol Ross. So the Welcome Center that's existing, and you sort of see the Program Center and the rear wall there that has that skylit in order to draw your eye through the courtyard, through the space, through a wood brise-soleil and screen that shades the glass, but also provides sort of a visual connection and also lantern effect at night, whereas this public space becomes a beacon to the community, showing its public programming and events. And from the interior, this is the multi-purpose space, the program room, where you make clear the connection both to that courtyard space beyond, and also directly to the chapel. The finishes here relate directly to the neighborhood, using gray plaster that's in a brighter tone than the chapel, and wood floors that recall the Menil collection down the street. The space is programmed for flexibility to support lectures, symposia, dinners, community events, yoga, things like that. So it's seen as not a formal polished space, but something that's really a space to be used and to be used by the community in many different ways. And then lastly, going back to the admin building, I'll highlight two spaces that are very important to the conception of the project that exist kind of on either end of the second floor of this volume. On the south end, I mentioned that the width and height of that south elevation corresponds directly to the chapel on the other side of the street. There's a large meeting room for community events on that upper floor that make that direct connection visible. And then at the northern end of the admin building, we have an archive, or the archive is located there, which really kind of takes on a more significant role and public role within the building, because there's a dedicated space made for both the storage and the display of the elements. And so I'll wrap up by saying this is an image of the current end of phase one, where the chapel itself is framed within the neighborhood. And really at the completion of the project, we feel like the buildings and landscape are more seamlessly integrated into the experience. Our office believes that architecture rises beyond mere form when it's in the service of something greater than itself, to foster relationships between people and place and between people. And really feel like that the project, the process, and the results of the project were able to realize that, and realize the chapel itself realizing Mark Rothko's original vision, and the expanded campus strengthening the chapel's mission for future generations. The completed project here reinforces that the Rothko Chapels as a living institution for both spiritual renewal and as a call to action. And that's where I'll stop. And I'll pause and I'll ask if there are any questions. I can check the chat as well.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute and we can have a group discussion here. So, or use the chat box as well.
Hi, I have a quick question. This is Urmila. So I'm just curious about, you'd shown this diagram with the light illumination levels and how initially it was more like a significant or drastic change and how it was modulated with the interventions. What was the original intent of the light experience? Was it that drastic change an intent, or what? Did you do any research into that? I'm just curious.
So our understanding is that so Mark Rothko never actually visited Houston and never saw the chapel in construction. And the original expectation was a much more, so as the paintings were, as the panels were created and painted in New York in that studio, there was an understanding or a kind of a simulation of that skylight with the parachute filter below. And so that was the original intent and experience that was meant to be recreated in Houston. And then it was clear sort of after the panels were in and once the building was open that intent didn't match that original conception.
Thank you.
I'll also ask, I'm curious, I know that the chapel has been open for maybe a year and a half now, either by appointment or open. Curious if anyone here has been there or what their experience is, or if they've been before and after. It took me maybe a year and a half. I was able to visit in last November for the first time, but we were in construction when in March of 2020 when the pandemic hit. So the project was close to completion at that point, but I wasn't able to see it for another year and a half.
I was able to visit it and I enjoyed it very much. I've been over the years, many, many years, and I really enjoyed the work that was done, the quality of light and everything, the procession in. It's very nice.
Thanks. It's nice to hear. I will say that even from the first time, in high school visiting the space, it is the chapel itself is a really unique place that doesn't exist anywhere else or anything close to that experience. I think we were just very lucky to be able to have the opportunity to work on it and spend so much time in the space and understand a little bit more what makes it powerful. But it's a really it's a really incredible, unique kind of singular space. And that paired with the chapel's mission made it, a real joy to work with, to work on as an architect.
Anyone else have any questions or comments? We have a quiet group tonight.
I think it was a very interesting presentation, and yeah, I think once we start getting out a little more, probably many of us will start visiting that place also, at least.
Yeah, I think it's also their commitment to access and openness is something that was really important, and something that's kind of drove a lot of our decisions about not just physical accessibility, but also the idea that the site itself wants to be open, like how imagining how visitors would approach a site and find the visitor center or find their way to the entry. But that was something that was repeated by the board and the chapel as one of their core values, the idea of openness and accessibility.
And just a few more questions there. In terms of the landscape, were there anything like original or historic identified when you were trying to make modifications and changes, besides the sculpture and the pool, which in terms of the trees?
Yeah, so there was,
else?
I could maybe talk to a few things, and maybe it's a little bit the opposite of things that need to be maintained. So there was originally, like I said, a couple components. There's a fairly faithful reinterpretation or installation of the exposed aggregate paving that makes up the plaza, with a slight modification. So every kind of decision here was reevaluated and tested kind of against those core value, those initial project principles. So the idea of that exposed aggregate and the feeling and texture of that was something that was really important to maintain. But then there was also a desire to actually darken it slightly in order to kind of lower the light levels at the exterior of the plaza. So there were a number of different mock-ups that were made to do that. And that was kind of another, one of those intent discussions with the chapel board to determine, what components of the design should respect the original, in terms of we wanted to make sure that we weren't doing a smooth non-exposed aggregate or something like that. So that the texture and feeling was the same, but then making these subtle changes in the service of the experience. So there were, that's one example I can think of. With regards to the plantings themselves, there's two things that come to mind. One is the bamboo kind of shield or planting, the relatively tall planting that bordered the west and south side of the pool itself, and understanding that was sort of done in response to a neighbor on the west side of the site. There was sort of maybe a contentious relationship, and that was put up as a barrier between the two. But really that helped define the site and there's sort of an asymmetry of the original kind of L-shaped arrangement. That was really important to maintain. We studied, creating a U or making some sort of symmetrical, I say we, and I mean ARO and NBW. There were times at which the design tried to formalize and create maybe more symmetrical or rigorous or kind of like more aligned to a rigorous interpretation of kind of that primary axis. And then in kind of discussions with the the chapel and the group, that kind of asymmetry and the openness that resulted in to the east, and to that kind of important public lawn that's maintained to the east of the reflecting pool was really maintained. And so there's a reinterpretation of that material, so that the bamboo is gone, and there are now these holly, these ilex bushes that kind of have replaced those. The other thing I'll note, just specific to that location, is that during the early planning process, we were able to determine that, if we could move the west lot line, 5 feet to the west, it would allow a little bit more breathing room for the planting, allow us to install some benches on the west side. And so there were discussions with the Menil to sort of shift that property line in kind of response to trading, giving back some land on the north side of the campus. So there's a little bit of like really focused asks that were really kind of surgical in a way, but that really kind of helped define that experience and made that a little better.
Yeah, no, that was very interesting. Can just imagine all the process and discussions and getting everybody on board and getting the vision across would have been.
I'll also say one other thing is that I think there was originally a palm tree on the site that was sort of kind of symbolized the kind of idea, the informality of the landscape. That was something that was, I don't think, it was kind of an outlier in terms of the original landscape, not really designed. It's sort of an outcome of just the development and the kind of the way the site, I think maybe somebody donated that palm tree and it was part of the history. And there was the chapel sort of embraced that instead of kind of shunning that in favor of a more, I don't know, a cleaner, more formal approach. And so there was an interesting balance, and those are some really productive, interesting discussions to be had.
So just one last question. So just curious as to how long the whole process took from like day one, getting the contract, starting the project to like finishing date.
I'll do this roughly. We started in 2016, and the first phase was a feasibility and master plan, and that was likely something like 6 months. Adam can jump in if he remembers. So there was a I want to say it was a focus study, but it was also a really comprehensive study of the different elements of the project, and defining the scope of the work in the chapel, and the scope of the work with the master plan, defining the program, or defining the program, and even massing and kind of strategies like that. So that was a fairly comprehensive approach, and that was maybe something like 6 months. And then there was, I think, a short period of deliberation on the chapel's end, where they confirmed the project direction. And then I don't recall exactly when we started schematic design on the implementation, but it was likely sometime in 2017. Construction started in January 2019, maybe the fall of 2018. I'm sorry, I don't recall exact dates, but those are that's roughly what's going on.
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah.
And the development of phase 2 and phase 1, the design of both happened concurrently. So we didn't just design phase 1 and then switch into phase 2. The design of both were kind of carried forward at the same time.
What kind of impact did you have when you found out that the existing CMU had to be reinforced? Schedule maybe, and as well as like budgetary impacts?
It was pretty big for both of those. I don't recall exact numbers in terms of budget, but it was a significant, essentially an unforeseen condition that was not planned for. And the method of the clearest method of doing that work was fairly invasive. We were really lucky that Lindbeck and their masonry team was able to kind of absorb that into the project fairly quickly, and so it went seamlessly. But it was kind of a recalibration of the the scope of our work. We weren't before then planning on taking down as much of the original plaster of the building. And so I think it took a little bit of coming to grips with that, but ultimately, it was a fairly easy decision. When the building is in peril of catastrophic failure, if a bad enough storm hit the building at the wrong place and time, the risk was far too high to not take that kind of approach or issue seriously.
Wanted to thank you for walking us through all this, and it's nice to know that a Houston region person got to work on the project because you grew up with it and knew it from a long-term perspective. I know I haven't been back into the chapel since it opened, but did walk the grounds, what I call a walk around that I did during COVID, and saw how the landscaping was being adjusted. I saw the new visitor center just about complete. So this gives me, I wanted to thank you because this gives me the sort of background information to how to go back through and walk through that whole campus again. And I'm interested in the meditation garden because I didn't quite understand, I didn't pay enough attention to realize that that's what that would become. So thank you for doing that overall campus view, as well as the sequence about how you handled all the light inside. So you did, I appreciate having both the overall campus integration of the design as well as the detail for the building. So thank you very much. Appreciate you coming down to do the, or doing this remotely, almost coming down to talk to us in person.
I was almost there in person.
Almost, right.
Yeah,
but
my parents are missing me. Would have had dinner with them tonight, but
Yeah.
that's okay. We'll see them soon.
It'll happen, yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you for the presentation.
You're very welcome, and thank you for that comment. That's very nice to hear.
Well, this is great. So we've got some other comments in the chat box. So, but if anyone has any last comment or question, I know it's an hour later there for you, Neil. So I want to let you have some time with your family tonight, and as well as, everyone else. So, but this was a really good presentation, and I too can't wait to go and see it since the renovation. So I guess with that, it doesn't look like anyone has any other questions. So we will wrap it up. And again, thank you so much, Neil, for working with us and transitioning to the virtual. And maybe we'll get you down here soon.
I hope so. And thank you so much for having me, and also, yeah, being flexible with the mode and Zoom. So that was really nice to still be able to do this.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks, Neil.
Take care.
Bye.